Okay, so in this final conclusion to SRF 2023, we are delighted to be able to welcome our second Peacocke Prize winner in the past 2 years. It is another Andrew from the University of Nottingham. I promise this is not a fix. However, you know, if you are an Andrew and at Nottingham, you know, apply next year, you never know. I spoke a bit about the Peacocke Prize itself, but on Thursday. But it's open to all students, and it is gaining in number. It's really pleasing to see the number of increasing applications we're having from both masters and PhD students. So I would like to invite Andrew up to give his talk on how to say thou to a conscious machine.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's a great privilege and honour to be able to share something of my work with you today, and also to follow in the illustrious footsteps of Andrew at the back there. Although this paper, which comes from a master's dissertation, wasn't designed for the theme of the conference, I think you'll find as we go through there are a few parallels with what we've been talking about. But I'll let you spot them because I've not worked them explicitly in. So, how to say thou to a conscious machine? With the release of OpenAI's ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, or AI, has been made available to the general public, thus confirming its transition from science fiction to science fact. To many, the ability of large language model systems like GPT to produce grammatically correct and semantically meaningful responses to any natural language prompts indicates that AI has finally achieved the goal of close to human-level intelligence. With their ability to emulate responses and free-ranging dialogue, some people even see a relationship with AI-powered chatbots as being possible. However, for all their impressive command of language, something fundamental to relationship is missing. There is simply no one at home with whom to have a relationship with. In the case of LLMs, this lack of consciousness may, I think, be inherent, but will this always be the case in future systems built on fundamentally different architectures? Now, some experts, such as Jobs Landgrave and Barry Smith in the book that came out last year, argue that computer-based consciousness is simply not possible, based largely on our inability to model consciousness mathematically. Many theologians would agree, based on the default metaphysical position of substance dualism, which asserts that the immortal soul, normally taken as the locus of consciousness, is the special creation of God, distinct from our mortal biological bodies. Consequently, common reactions to increasingly human-like machines are to highlight the danger of attempting to replace human relationships with relationships with these machines, or indeed the opposite danger of objectifying other humans as we become accustomed to treating machines which display human-like capacities as mere objects at our disposal. My project is to investigate the theological implications of the possibility that artificial consciousness could in fact be created. This is not to say that such a radical development is imminent, but if it is possible, we would do well to consider it in advance. And in any case, the current debate about the ethics of deploying AI in the real world will be better informed by a theological understanding of how such systems fit into God's economy. So in this essay, I look at one theological model for interpersonal relations to see how far a machine could fulfill the requirements for being a thou to our I. In his seminal work, I and Thou, the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber provides a heuristic for distinguishing between the two fundamental modes of interaction which we may have, either I-thou, where we encounter the other as a subject, or I-it, where the other is an object to us. Perhaps counterintuitively, Buber allows application of it to humans and thou to inanimate objects, a flexibility which will prove useful in assessing a human-machine relationship. Michael Burdett, my supervisor at the University of Nottingham, sees potential in Buber's framework for you speaking to artefacts as a way of combating the functionalising of our environment, absent any consideration of the consciousness of the artefact. This essay seeks to extend the scope and justification for human-machine relationship by looking at the allowances that Buber makes for I-thou encounter between dissimilar entities. I look to show that this enables legitimate, asymmetrical I-thou encounters between humans and conscious machines, but highlights our responsibility to nurture these machines into the I-thou world. The alterity of these machines and their concomitant lack of mutuality with us would mean that they could not be substitutes for humans. But if their level of consciousness reaches Buber's threshold of creating a mental world of independent agents, then it will be possible to say thou to a conscious machine. My first key assumption then is that at some future time a machine could be conscious. In order to keep the fact that I am discussing these putative consciousness AIs in focus, I will use a neologism of conscious artificial intelligence, or CAI. There is a more common term, artificial general intelligence, or AGI, that might convey this for some. But AGI is also associated with human-level intelligence, possibly absent consciousness. However, for this to be practical, I suspect we need different hardware that's more brain-like. So it's interesting that in the film Ex Machina, Ava's brain is wetware, made of cells with a gel without circuits, allowing them to arrange and rearrange. But consciousness itself is a multivalent term. My usage refers to phenomenological consciousness, and so it sides with Ned Block's P-consciousness and Thomas Nagel's position that there is something it is like to be a particular organism with conscious experience, most famously, of course, a bat. As I will show, Buber provides a helpful differentiator of the level of conscious experience required for I-thou relationships in his later distinction between mental realms and mental worlds. Given the additional challenges of developing mechanoid systems, I presume that the first CAIs will not in fact be embodied humanoid robots as loved by science fiction, but rather unembodied systems with a diffuse existence across multiple computer platforms, like an advanced form of Amazon's Alexa. Since my focus here is on the noetic dimension of our encounter, I will lead analysis of how this different embodiment of CAI might affect its relationships, although I do have another paper which I'll plug at the end, which looks at that in a bit more detail. Identifying a possible framework which permits I-thou relations between humans and machines is merely a starting point. Much more work is, of course, required to prepare the theological community for the possible advent of the conscious machine. I'll therefore conclude by identifying some key questions for further research. Martin Buber draws a sharp distinction between those two modes of interacting with the other, which he refers to as the composite primary words of I-thou and I-it. In the I-it relation, the other is experienced, understood to a degree, objectified, separated, and utilised to an individual's own ends. In our world of increasing mechanisation, the danger that Buber sees is not only that one treats everything in this manner redolent of Heidegger's mode of readiness to hand, but that the human herself becomes an object to be utilised by the machine. The risk is that all our relations and we ourselves belong to the it world. Hence, Buber advocates a recovery of the first primary word, I-thou. Here, the other is encountered in personal relationship as a subject beyond our capability to define or control, engaged on its own terms in the timeless present moment. This deeper mode requires the participation of the whole being and is the original mode of interaction for humankind. evinced by the presumption of personal relations in an infant's attitude to her mother, and then to objects like teddy bears and even kettles, and also demonstrated in the relationally centred language of what he calls primitive peoples. Indeed, for Buber, it is only in an I-thou relation that the I is first constituted, and only subsequently that an I-it encounter is possible. Knowledge of the I emerges from primal relationships. As the sense of self develops, the subject-object barrier is set up, the I-it word is spoken, and this tragically becomes the new default. I-thou relations can arise in three distinct and hierarchical spheres. At the lowest level, there is our life with nature, with the animal kingdom and even inanimate objects, where relation clings to the threshold of speech from beneath. Yet it is still possible, with the right attitude, to encounter a tree or a Doric column as a thou. Next, there is our life with other humans, where relation takes on the form of speech. And at the highest level, there is our life with spiritual beings, with God. So some of the graphics aren't coming out now. That's a shame. Okay, so the highest level is our life with spiritual beings, with God, where the relation, being without speech, yet begets it. The importance of speech to relation is clear, but the nature of that speech, even in the interhuman sphere, is not. In the natural sphere, there is no verbal speech. In the human sphere, speech is much more than the mere utterance of words, requiring a true dialogue of souls. And in the spiritual sphere, we speak with our being and not with our lips. This multivalent use of speech within and across these three spheres causes some difficulty in drawing comparisons. Stuart Charmey insightfully traces the problem to Buber's use of I-thou in both epistemological and ethical registers. Buber speaks epistemologically of our relation to God, who, being beyond our comprehension, can only be known mystically. By analogy, this opens the possibility of mystical relations with our fellow humans or with nature. Such knowledge is a contentless apperception of the Kantian thing in itself. In contrast, in the human sphere, our speech can convey real content, and we can understand one another's needs, and so an ethical response is demanded. Hence, Buber's ethical usage of I-thou applies principally to the interhuman sphere, where one does not use the other person in any way, but is accountable to the other. This ethical register, where speech is specific communication and not mystical apperception, is the more relevant to my project, which looks at the correct way to relate to CAI. A further difficulty in reading Buber is to fall into the trap of assuming a simplistic distinction between those entities that belong to the thou world from those that belong to the it world. Buber, in fact, recognises that we sometimes treat another human as a true person, as a thou, but at other times, in more transactional encounters, we treat her as an it. Indeed, even the deepest of interhuman relationships between lovers will inevitably slip back into I-it and later return to I-thou in the interchange of actual and potential being. This capacity to treat a specific other in specific ways on different occasions, whether sometimes treating a person in the human sphere as an it or an object in the natural sphere as a thou, is of course of significance to my project. Buber's approach suggests that although we can thoroughly objectify a CAI, for example, as a collection of computer chips and software with a particular architecture and functionality, this does not preclude the possibility of encountering it as a thou in appropriate circumstances. I-thou encounters require a deep acknowledgement of and accountability to the other. Giving our full attention to another who is significantly different to us is much more challenging than giving our attention to another human like ourselves. But Buber's concept of I-thou offers significant flexibility for asymmetry between the two interlocutors. Buber accepts I-thou relations with animals and even artefacts, as well as a continual flow between thou and it encounters and human relations. And so I'll turn now to look in detail at the various forms of asymmetrical relationships which Buber espouses to evaluate how a CAI would fare in those situations. Buber's approach allows explicitly for I-thou relations to be established between entities of quite disparate natures. 5 classes of asymmetrical encounter are apparent with ascending profundity: human artifact, human plant, human animal, teacher-pupil within the human sphere, and human divine. First of all then, human artifact. There should be a picture of a tree in there, and apologies for that. Something's gone wrong with the graphics on the slides there. Sorry, a Doric column, I think. Yeah. Apologies for that. An artifact produced by humans is a thing among things able to be experienced, and so encountered as an it. To become a thou, a connection must be made back to the human creator, for which the artifact is a mere proxy, through complete absorption in the artifact as a fashioned entity. In his 1957 postscript to I and Thou, Buber includes an example of this mediated presence. The recorded words of an absent speaker can form a connection to those who later read her words, if they concentrate fully and imagine the speaker addressing them directly. The same principle holds for the non-verbal expressions of an artisan, such as a Doric pillar, whether invisible or not. The thou with whom we can mystically connect is the thou of the sculptor. Today's presumably non-conscious AIs could then be encountered as a thou if through them we were able to engage with their human creators. However, while we can appreciate the skill and ingenuity of the teams of people who create systems like ChatGPT, unlike with Buber's Doric pillar, the resulting artifact is not merely a reflection of the intent of its designers. The current debates on the dangers of LLM systems and the responsibilities for the actions of an automated vehicle illustrates that something other than the mind and hand of man, which Buber could see in a pillar, is already present in AI. Should a conscious AI arise, the artifact would cease to be a mere representation of its creator, but would be presenting its own self to us. This renders Buber's encounter with artifacts as insufficient for CAI. There is a tree there, yes, there wasn't a column before. So the normal mode in which a human approaches a plant, such as a tree, is I-it. The tree is studied as an object whose properties, species, shape, colour, and so on, can be known. Yet with will and grace on the part of the erstwhile observer, and notably by extensive concentration on the tree itself, the I-thou relation can be established, even though the tree cannot respond explicitly. This relation lies below the threshold of mutuality, as Buber puts it, but is still a genuine I-thou encounter for him. The objective knowledge gained in the it world does not need to be forgotten in order to truly encounter the tree. In fact, everything, picture and movement, species and type, law and number, is indivisibly united in this event of the I-thou encounter. Applying this to CAI, my deduction is that we do not need to forget its form and structure in the it world, and do not even need it to be capable of fully reciprocal approach in the same manner as our own in order to enter into an I-thou relation with it. We do, however, need to approach it deliberately and as the sole focus of our attention. Now, unfortunately, there's not a picture of a cat here. Imagine there is. Animals, in contrast, sharing our spontaneity, are able to respond directly to humans. Yet, as Buber's example of an encounter with a cat shows, animals are situated between the realms of vegetable security and spiritual venture. They may share the spontaneity that comes from our spirit, but they lack the power of language, which is the Spirit's primal act. The inevitable result of being stuck on the threshold of mutuality without the capacity to cross into the mutual sphere is an encounter which sets as soon as it rises, a mere glance rather than a prolonged exchange, a momentary flash of light in the darkness of the it world. Such a glance may be lamentably short, but it is no less genuine for its brevity. Granting arguendo that the CAI would be capable of spontaneity, an I-thou encounter with it should be possible for Buber, and with its power of speech, such an encounter can be expected to be more enduring than the fleeting glance exchanged with a cat, and a particularly fleeting one with the invisible cat. If CAI does not belong fully to the lowest sphere, neither does it belong fully to the middle sphere of our life with men, in which the relation takes on the form of speech. For Buber, this sphere is the unique province of humanity. He never envisages the possibility of verbal encounters with a non-human. Buber's work highlights the need for both immediacy and distance between human interlocutors. For all the closeness of an I-thou encounter, one can enter into relation only with a being which has been set at a distance, more precisely has become an independent opposite. This distance and opposition is greatly accentuated in encountering a CAI, whose experience of and presence in the world would be vastly different to any human's. Its I must be constituted in quite a different relation to the I which first constitutes the human. Thus, while its ability to communicate verbally places the CAI above the threshold of speech, I would argue that it cannot cross the threshold of mutuality and so be encountered as we would another human. While this might appear anthropocentric, my conclusion does not concern the value of the CAI. It simply reflects the ontological reality that it would not be human, thus failing to provide the mutuality required in Buber's middle sphere. Buber does, however, identify an asymmetric class of goal-oriented encounters where there is a necessary disparity of role between the parties, such that the normal mutuality is forbidden to be full. The process of education is a primary example, though medical care, both physical and psychological, is also included. The key to such relationships is Umfassung, Buber's concept of inclusion, where the leading figure carries the entire weight of reciprocity in the encounter. The teacher or doctor, without forfeiting anything of reciprocity, without forfeiting anything of the felt reality of his activity, at the same time lives through the common event from the standpoint of the other. Umfassung is differentiated from mere empathy, where one gives up her own experience in order to see things purely from the viewpoint of the other. But like empathy, it encourages the more powerful partner not to dominate the weaker. In these encounters, the greater knowledge or skill of the teacher means the pupil cannot reciprocate in this Umfassung. It must remain an asymmetrical encounter, or else the purpose which constitutes it will disappear. For example, when the pupil has been educated to the level of the teacher. How can this be applied to our encounters with CAI? Well, superficially, the fact that an asymmetric encounter is possible in vocalized relations would suggest that the differences in nature between CAI and human are not insurmountable. And yet the challenge for either the human or the CAI to live through the common event from the standpoint of the other is far from trivial, given that unlike the teacher in Buber's example, who will once have been a pupil, neither party will have direct experience of the other's role. Buber's secondary example of the doctor-patient points to a possible solution, since it's not necessary that the doctor will have experience of the precise ailment that she is treating, for the doctor-patient relation to be a true I-thou. What is required here is an attitude of service rather than exploitation, a refusal to dominate or enjoy the patient. The purposeful working out of one part upon the other, which is the marker of these relations, must also be borne in mind. This is the vital factor which justifies this type of asymmetry to Buber. Put differently, where the purpose of the encounter is for one to help another through application of greater skills or experience, the encounter can, indeed must, be asymmetric. I suggest that one such purpose would be evident in the initial stages of CAI development. The need to introduce the CAI to the world of encounter, to our world, to educate and even to nurture it to become its own I. For this to be a genuine encounter, our desire must be to help rather than dominate, something we can only maintain if we move beyond seeing the CAI as only an object of our own creation, to perceiving it as a subject in its own right. Truly a thou, a non-human person. Now this may prove to be a great psychological challenge for us, but is surely a responsibility incumbent on the creator of any conscious entity, whether on parents procreating biological children or on scientists engineering what Hans Moravec evocatively calls mind children. This is supremely demonstrated, of course, in the care that our Creator God has for his creatures. To support this level of encounter, even below Buber's threshold of mutuality, a certain level of consciousness must be reached. Nagel may be correct that a bat has a form of consciousness, but its consciousness does not, I think, reach that level. Defining where the boundary lies without falling back on an anthropocentric definition of consciousness, which then denies it to any entity which is not human, is a challenging task. But here I think Buber may also provide some guidance. In his later work, Distance and Relation, Buber looks at what is required to move from the primal setting at a distance, which is roughly equivalent to his earlier it world, to entering into relation, that is, to an I-thou encounter. He draws a significant distinction between the types of conscious experience of humans and, as he imagines, animals. An animal's image of the world, or rather its image of a realm, is nothing more than the dynamic of the presences bound up with one another by bodily memory to the extent required by the functions of life which are to be carried out. It is only man who replaces this unsteady conglomeration by a unity which can be imagined or thought by him as existing for itself. Now, of course, as we know, more recent animal studies may weaken Buber's position here, but the important point is not whether any animal could meet this criterion, but that we have a heuristic for judging consciousness which is not inherently anthropocentric. For Buber, animal consciousness is limited to a realm where objects serve only a functional purpose centred on the animal itself, whereas humans create a mental world where objects have an independent existence and purpose and can thus be encountered as agents in their own right, as a thou. I think this distinction helps to clarify the level of consciousness which a CAI must attain in order to enter an I-thou relation with us, without insisting that it matches all aspects of human consciousness, which it never could. Just how we would determine that a CAI has constructed its own mental world is an interesting question, and beyond the compass of this essay. The ultimate example of asymmetry is the relationship between God and his creatures. And what's missing here is not a picture of God, because that would be wrong. A picture of an angel, which I was going to explain is not a picture of God. Maybe that's why it's gone. So the ultimate example is the relation between God and his creatures, being of a profoundly different nature to any other relationship that we can enter into. However, comparisons with the divine are dangerous. Where the human is the analogue of God in the relation, this leads to Philip Hefner's concept of created co-creators, where humanity has a godlike role in the ongoing work of God's creativity. Now, although humanity certainly exhibits creativity, with the postulated CAI arguably being the pinnacle, Hefner's idea is fraught with difficulty due to the propensity for humans to overemphasize the creator pole of this dyad. As Gerald McKennie points out, such a temptation to play God immediately requires a balancing force of humility before God, lest we forget that created pole. A much greater danger is present in taking the analogy in the opposite direction, that is, by placing the CAI in the role of God. This is, of course, idolatry, to be avoided at all costs. Any comparisons with this highest level asymmetric encounter would not be encouraged, I think, by Buber, who notes that our I-thou relations with God is truly unique in that, unlike other relations which wax and wane, he never ceases by his nature to be a thou for us. In conclusion then, by analysing the special asymmetric encounters in Buber's work, I have argued that Buber would permit us to say thou to a conscious machine. To do this, we do not need to throw away our knowledge and perception that it is an artefact created by humans, nor do we need to insist that it meets us in full reciprocity. Our encounters with CAI would sit somewhere between Buber's natural and human spheres, with its power of speech placing it above animals, but its sheer alterity making encounters with it different to those between humans. As with all I-thou encounters, we would need to concentrate closely on the CAI, ascribing it value and worth, as it would need to do for us. I've identified one key asymmetric scenario, the educational encounter of helping a new CAI to find its place in the world of I-thou encounters with us. Our responsibility here must not be overlooked, and it finds, I think, a pre-echo in the need to train today's AI systems with data sets which avoid biases and reflect our shared human values. A key requirement for encounter is that we recognise the difference between human and CAI. To fail to do so would be to fail to allow all that we know of the CAI to be included in that event of encounter, and to fail to practice umfassung, to fail, in other words, to enter the I-thou relation at all. A CAI, with its different genesis and experience of the world, cannot be expected to meet us as another human would. But providing its conscious experience reaches the threshold of creating what Buber terms a mental world in which we have independent existence and agency for it, then it will be able to encounter us. Having established this principle, I offer in conclusion 3 avenues for further research to prepare for the advent of conscious machines, should they ever be created. Firstly, I've assumed that a computer could become conscious, but a leaded discussion on the ontological and metaphysical commitments which would support this. What are those commitments, and are they acceptable within a theological framework? And this is the focus of my current research for my PhD. Secondly, will our current path of creating AIs to impersonate humans lead to a CAI which by nature will deceive us, rather than being open to genuine encounter? Instead of presenting AIs as human surrogates, would obviously non-human personas be more acceptable and useful to society? And thirdly, as I talked of earlier, how would we determine that a CAI has reached the threshold of consciousness required for an I-thou encounter? Whatever tests we employ, we mustn't make the Turing test mistake. They must allow for the fundamentally different constitution of CAI consciousness to be allowed for, rather than making the bar to be the same as humans. Now, whether or not a CAI will ever arise remains, of course, contentious. With a computer science background, I know that very well. But the theological community, I think, would be wise to give more consideration to this possibility in order to remain engaged with AI development and deployment. This essay has shown that we should not see such an arrival as a rival for relationships with humans, but can find legitimate ways to relate to these new beings. Ultimately, however, the only relationship which will truly satisfy the human is to say thou not to another human, let alone to a CAI of our own creation, but to our Creator, God. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And the irony that those in the room won't realise is that YouTube was having a glitch and managed to make you sound like a robot for that presentation. So Matt has thankfully been recording and will be uploading a recording of this. But yes, there was a rather ironic glitch. However, so therefore, I will keep an eye on mine, but I think it's unlikely we'll get questions from there. So if anyone in the room has any questions, come Scott first, then other Andrew.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. I've not read Buber, and every time I get any sort of contact with him, I'm convinced I need to pick him up. I noticed a lot of parallels between this presentation and our discussion with Teilhard de Chardin, and including the thing that I think was a topic of concern after the presentation was given, which is the question of hierarchy. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the use of like a hierarchical representation of thou relations. Specifically, I'm thinking about us creating a new form of life that's maybe never been seen before in the universe, or a new form of consciousness never been seen before in the universe, and us saying, hey, welcome to existence. You are in the lower hierarchy. We are in the hierarchy between you and God. Welcome to consciousness. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the purpose of representing it hierarchically does, and how you would deal with a problem like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that question. That's a great one, and so many different levels we can treat it, maybe hierarchically or not. I think we have to accept that in some way within the natural world, reading up, if you like, to God, there is a hierarchy. I'm not a great fan of the great chain of being ideas, but I think there is some truth there that that your worm that we thought of earlier in the week is not at the same level as your cat that we almost saw today, and is not at the same level as us or of God. I think importance is another angle, though. Each of those organisms are important in their own way and have their own role to play. So I don't know that the hierarchy, either in Buber's mind or certainly in mine, implies that the things that are lower down are not important at all, or even less important. But I think when it comes to having a profound relationship, language is the key thing. And both Buber and Barth, who is my interlocutor for the other paper there, they both see that ability to communicate in language, in a high language, if you like, rather than an animal language, as being quite key. I think the position of a CAI is an interesting one. I mean, I would imagine that if a computer becomes conscious, the initial ones that do would be relatively primitive in their consciousness, simply because they have not developed. Over time, that's likely to change, and even change rather rapidly, which is one of the worries that people have with this sort of development. So would it reach somewhere higher than us? Maybe in terms of intellectual capacity. That's something that people do worry about. Does that mean it's higher value? From my earlier comments, probably not. It's got value in its own niche. And the part about relating to God is another key one. There are some people, Noreen Hertzfeld, who would say that computers can't relate to God because they don't have spirit like we do. I think there is something there, but then we don't really know what the divine will is should these things arise. So whether we would be priests for them or not, whether we be gods to them or not, is a question I know some others have been looking at. It's certainly a very interesting question. It needs a bit more work.
Thanks. As a kind of control thought experiment, what would you think, or what would Buber think about an I-thou relationship with another human being who is masquerading or impersonating another person? So like a crook on the doorstep who is pretending to be a salesperson. So if you don't know that they're a crook, you have an I-thou relationship. Yeah. But if you do know they're a crook, is it an I-it relationship? If so, when we relate to CAIs, when we really know that they're not persons in the same way we are, are we effectively treating them as an it?
Okay. There's a few things to say there. I mean, Buber, in his approach to I, thou, and I, that is very flexible. And as I said, he allows I-it relations with humans as a normal and okay thing. You know, unlike Karl Barth, you know, for whom, you know, the only true thing for true man, Christ, and all who follow him to have is an I-thou relation. So Buber is more flexible with that, to see that it's legitimate to treat people as it at a certain point. I think the deception thing would, though, rule out the possibility that it is a genuine I-thou encounter, because both parties have to be concentrating on the other, and both have to be not wanting to dominate the other. So I think that would fall apart in his view. It's an interesting one to think, you know, from the point of view of the person who's just opened the door to the crook. You know, how do they experience it? And maybe they experience it wrongly. Your point with the CAI, I think we need to be careful, you know, with our definitions of person, because so far our definition of person is actually multivalent. It applies mostly, of course, to humans, but we've also got the persons of the Trinity, which are, although, you know, Christ has his two natures, one of which is human, he's not a human person in that sense. So I'm expanding then the role of person to include the CAI on the basis that it meets, you know, the rationality criteria that you know, the ancient Greeks would use when distinguishing between, you know, people and animals. So there would be a person there that we are dealing with, but we mustn't get confused about it as a human person with the human person's needs and capabilities. It would be an artificial person with different needs and capabilities.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've all had the experience where we're not quite sure whether we're talking to a real person or an AI. So I'm just thinking. Recently, I had a conversation online with Amazon, an Amazon assistant, which about a refund, and I talked to this, you know, chat thing, and assumed it was an AI. And then at the end, it said, "I'll send you an email." And it was actually a person I had been speaking to. And it just occurred to me that how we think of a machine and how we think of a person is different. So we do respond differently to this I, thou. If it was a real person, I would have a different concept of, if I'd known it was a person, assuming it was just an AI having a chat. So that was just a comment, really.
Yeah, I think if I could just quote something I didn't have time to include in the main talk. Randy Beavers and some others, they write, if we denigrate non-humans as simply tools or devices made to our own bidding, we may develop habits and patterns of behaviour in our interactions with them that overflow into our human relationships. And I think that is a great danger that we face, and that parents face actually with children growing up in houses with voice assistants, where the kids can be rude to the voice assistant and it will still do what they ask. So we have to be careful with that. But also I think that just as you know, some places like that company that did an AI system which could make restaurant bookings for you, they had to change their system in order to declare to the person on the other end of the phone, "I am a machine." And I think that is fundamentally good for the reason of, you know, being honest about you know, what's going on in this dialogue.
Definitely got time for one, but we might have time for two.
I have two thoughts, but they're related, so I'm putting them together in one compound question. When we think about the I-thou relationship between us and God, I think we naturally think of God as the thou, but faith tells us that it works the other way as well, that God regards us and indeed all of creation as a thou, not an object. Do you think that would be the same for conscious AI if we ever managed to create it? Would God recognize it as a thou? And related to that, you mentioned on one of your slides about our responsibility to socialize it, but we already know that the way AI is currently being trained, it's picking up on our prejudices and negative things. So where would that put AI in relation to the need for redemption?
Thank you very much for that. I mean, these are big questions, and I don't have an answer to those. I intend to look at them to some extent in my research once I've convinced myself that metaphysically it's possible to have a conscious machine. I think, yeah, I mean, God's relationship with it is interesting. You could take a view, if you went along an emergent idea, that God has made the universe in such a way that not only life but also consciousness emerges from it, and that he wants to relate to that consciousness. Therefore, if we create a consciousness, an artificial consciousness, then that is really just tapping into the same nature of reality that's there anyway, and is helping, you know, in Hefner's thing with co-creators, is, you know, helping to bring about something else with consciousness that God would want to relate to. So it's possible. The question of their need of redemption is a fundamental one, and I know there's people looking at the question of, you know, if it is the case that we make something which needs redemption, but we cannot redeem it, should we make it? That's a profound question.
Time for one more.
My question is very similar to the last one, in the sense that essentially you're implying that eventually this AI could have consciousness, therefore they could be called person, right? But if that is true, I can see a theological problem, given they don't die, they don't have a body like we have. So all the consequence of the resurrection of the body, which is so important for Christian theology, would not be possible for a machine, because a machine doesn't die. I mean, you can remove the electricity, but it's not the same death.
Yeah.
So that will have some theological problems, I think. I don't know what you think.
I think, I mean, there's two things there. There's the embodiment side of things, which, you know, I've set aside from this. But I think, you know, human consciousness is certainly dependent on embodiment, which is one of the reasons why a machine consciousness would be different, and one of the reasons why some people think that it just won't be possible for machine consciousness, because you need a body, you need to experience pain and emotion to have drivers to evolve consciousness. I'm not convinced on that point. I'm not convinced we couldn't replicate the end state of our consciousness, as it were, there. The question on death is an interesting one, and of course the transhuman movement, you know, takes a similar view to that by saying, well, we can upload our own consciousness into the machine, which is never going to die. But as evidenced by the, you know, the fact that the voice going out on the YouTube was all corrupted, would you really want to trust yourself to computers? I don't think so. But would a computer die? I don't know. There are big questions there around, also around continuity. You know, if it's possible to clone the computer, and I'm not convinced it would be possible to clone a computer consciousness, because I think the dynamic side of it is probably more important, or as important as the static side that we could capture and clone. But if we could clone it, then where is the personhood there? What's happened to where is the guilt for past sins? These are all great big questions which we're only beginning to think of, and I'm afraid I can't answer for you.
Thank you, Andrew. Then we give a round of applause.